About 10,000 years ago, humans began to farm. This agricultural revolution was a turning point in our history that enabled people to settle, build, and create. In short, agriculture enabled the existence of civilization. Today, approximately 40% of our planet is farmland. Spread all over the world, these agricultural lands are the pieces to a global puzzle we are all facing. In the future, how can we feed every member of a growing population a healthy diet? Meeting this goal will require nothing short of a second agricultural revolution. The first agricultural revolution was characterized by expansion and exploitation, feeding people at the expense of forests, wildlife, and water, and destabilizing the climate in the process. That's not an option the next time around. Agriculture depends on a stable climate, with predictable seasons and weather patterns. This means we can't keep expanding our agricultural lands because doing so will undermine the environmental conditions that make agriculture possible in the first place. Instead, the next agricultural revolution will have to increase the output of our existing farmland for the long term, while protecting biodiversity, conserving water, and reducing pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. So what will the future farms look like? This drone is part of a fleet that monitors the crops below. The farm may look haphazard, but it's a delicately engineered use of the land that intertwines crops and livestock with wild habitats. Conventional farming methods cleared large swathes of land and planted them with a single crop, eradicating wildlife and emitting huge amounts of greenhouse gases in the process. This approach aims to correct that damage. Meanwhile, moving among the crops, teams of field robots apply fertilizer in targeted doses. Inside the soil, hundreds of sensors gather data on nutrients and water levels. This information reduces unnecessary water use and tells farmers where they should apply more and less fertilizer, instead of causing pollution by showering it across the whole farm. But the farms of the future won't be all sensors and robots. These technologies are designed to help us produce food in a way that works with the environment rather than against it, taking into account the nuances of local ecosystems. Lower-cost agricultural practices can also serve those same goals and are much more accessible to many farmers. In fact, many such practices are already in use today and stand to have an increasingly large impact as more farmers adopt them. In Costa Rica, farmers have intertwined farmland with tropical habitat so successfully that they've significantly contributed to doubling the country's forest cover. This provides food and habitat for wildlife, as well as natural pollination and pest control from the birds and insects these farms attract, producing food while restoring the planet. In the United States, ranchers are raising cattle on grasslands composed of native species, generating a valuable protein source using production methods that store carbon and protect biodiversity. In Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Nepal, new approaches to rice production may dramatically decrease greenhouse gas emissions in the future. Rice is a staple food for 3 billion people, and the main source of livelihood for millions of households. More than 90% of rice is grown in flooded paddies, which use a lot of water and release 11% of annual methane emissions, which accounts for 1 to 2% of total annual greenhouse gas emissions globally. By experimenting with new strains of rice, irrigating less, and adopting less labor-intensive ways of planting seeds, farmers in these countries have already increased their incomes and crop yields while cutting down on greenhouse gas emissions. In Zambia, numerous organizations are investing in locally specific methods to improve crop production, reduce forest loss, and improve livelihoods for local farmers. These efforts are projected to increase crop yield by almost a quarter over the next few decades. If combined with methods to combat deforestation in the region, they could move the country toward a resilient, climate-focused agricultural sector. And in India, where up to 40% of post-harvest food is lost or wasted due to poor infrastructure, farmers have already started to implement solar-powered cold storage capsules that help thousands of rural farmers preserve their produce and become a viable part of the supply chain. It will take all of these methods, from the most high-tech to the lowest cost, to revolutionize farming. High-tech interventions stand to amplify climate and conservation-oriented approaches to farming, and large producers will need to invest in implementing these technologies. Meanwhile, we'll have to expand access to the lower-cost methods for smaller-scale farmers. This vision of future farming will also require a global shift toward more plant-based diets and huge reductions in food loss and waste, both of which will reduce pressure on the land and allow farmers to do more with what they have available. If we optimize food production, both on land and sea, we can feed humanity within the environmental limits of the Earth. But there's a very small margin of error, and it will take unprecedented global cooperation and coordination of the agricultural lands we have today. An agricultural revolution can start with you. Join Countdown, a global initiative bringing together scientists, activists, urban planners, farmers, business leaders, artists, and you. Together, we'll champion bold solutions to the climate crisis and turn those ideas into decisive action. Find out how you can be part of building a cleaner future by visiting ed.ted.com/countdown.
Good day everyone! Today we will tackle about the agricultural transformation and rural development. When we say agricultural transformation, it is broadly defined as the process over time by which the agri-food system evolves from subsistence-oriented and farm-centered into more commercialized, productive, and off-farm-centered. On the other hand, rural development is the process of improving the quality of life and economic well-being of people living in rural areas, often relatively isolated and sparsely populated areas. These rural areas may be isolated and sparsely populated, but in most cases, they offer a picturesque natural setting which is a rich culture. Under this topic, we will discuss the imperative of agricultural progress and rural development, agricultural growth, past progress and current challenges, and the structure of agrarian systems in the developing world. These are the subtopics part 1. So let's start with the quote. It is in the agricultural sector that the battle for long-term economic development will be won or lost. So this statement made by a Nobel laureate in economics, Professor Gunnar Myrdal, is much applicable to developing countries where agriculture and rural development has become an essential ingredient of national development. Approximately half of the world population resides in the rural areas. Majority of the population in rural areas depend on agriculture. Therefore, importance of agricultural and rural development cannot be overemphasized. Poorest rural areas need to be developed first, otherwise development in third world nations cannot be achieved. In order to win battle for long-term economic development, government must undertake certain policies aiming at encouraging technologies innovation and in farms. It is evident that boosting agriculture sectors' productivity stimulates economic development in various other sectors. Hence, Gunnar Myrdal's assertion could be considered a truism. The imperative of agricultural transformation and rural development come to show the situations of such development over time that leads to major changes in the progress of current scenarios. If the migration of people with and without school certificates to the cities of Africa, Asia, and Latin America is proceeding at historical rates, a large part of the explanation can be found in the economic stagnation of outlying rural areas. People living in the countryside comprise considerably more than half the population of different nations of the world. Despite real progress, nearly 2 billion people in the developing world grind out a meager and often inadequate existence in agricultural pursuits. Over 3.1 billion living in rural areas in developing countries, about a quarter of them in extreme poverty. And despite the extraordinary urbanization taking place throughout the world, people living in the countryside make up more than 60% of the population in both low and lower middle income countries on average. Second, vast majority of the world poorest, over two-thirds people, are located in rural areas and engage primarily in subsistence agriculture. Countries whose population is more than 80% rural include Ethiopia, Nepal, Niger, Papua New Guinea, Rwanda, South Sudan, Sri Lanka, and Uganda. India remains more than two-thirds rural. Over two-thirds of the world's poorest people are also located in rural areas and engage primarily in subsistence agriculture. Third, their basic concern is survival. Many hundreds of millions of people have been bypassed by whatever economic progress their nations have attained. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization estimated that in 2012, about 870 million people did not have enough food to meet their basic nutritional needs. If development is to take place and become self-sustaining, it will have to include the rural areas in general and the agricultural sector in particular. The core problems of widespread poverty, growing inequality, and rapid population growth all originate in the stagnation and often retrogression of economic life in rural areas, particularly in Africa. Uh, 5. Agricultural development is now seen as an important part of any development strategy. Today, most development economists share the consensus that far from playing a passive, supporting role in the process of economic development, the agricultural sector in particular and the rural economy in general must play an indispensable part in any overall strategy of economic progress, especially for the low-income developing countries. Stages of agricultural transformation. Stage number one is the traditional agriculture. It is a technologically stagnant stage in which production is increased largely through slowly increased application of traditional forms of land, labor, and capital. The increase in output takes place through an essentially symmetrical expansion of all inputs or through increased input of the already abundant low productivity resources. Declining income and productivity per unit of an input is a common feature of this phase. Stage number two, technologically dynamics agriculture, low capital technology. In this stage, a complex of technological changes substantially increases the efficiency of agricultural processes and raises the rate of increase of agricultural production. The critical characteristics of this stage, as compared with stage 1, is the constant generation and application of technology, which is facilitated by a complex institutional framework. And stage number 3, technologically dynamic agriculture, high capital technology. This is a stage when agriculture has much of its relative importance in the generation of the national income. Agriculture of various developed countries is included in this stage. Government's role in different stages is quite important. In nature, of course, it is different. An agriculture and employment-based strategy of economic development requires three basic complementary elements. Number one, accelerated output growth through technological, institutional, and price incentive changes designed to raise the productivity of small farmers. And second, rising domestic demand for agricultural output derived from an employment-oriented urban development strategy. And third, the diversified non-agricultural intensive rural development activities that directly and indirectly support and are supported by the farming community. To a large extent, therefore, agricultural and rural development has come to be regarded by many economists as the sine qua non of national development. Without such integrated rural development, in most cases, industrial growth either would be stultified or, if it succeeded, would create severe internal imbalances in the economy. So, what is the integrated rural development? Broad spectrum of rural development activities, including small farmers, agricultural progress, the provision of physical and social infrastructure, and development of rural non-farm industries, and the capacity of rural sector to sustain and accelerate the pace of this improvement over time. It is the process of combining multiple development services into a coherent delivery system with the aim of improving the well-being of rural population. It enables linking agriculture with other economic activities whereby an adequate approach to regional development contributing to a more balanced development among regions. So let's proceed to the second subtopic, the agricultural growth, past progress, and current challenges. The ability of agricultural production to keep pace with the world population growth has been impressive, defying some neo-maltation predictions that global food shortage would have emerged by now. And it has actually been output gains in the developing world that have led the way. And according to World Bank estimates, the developing world experienced faster growth in the value of agricultural output 2.6% per year than the developed world 0.9% per year during the period 1980 to 2004. Correspondingly, developing countries' share of global agriculture GDP rose from 56% to 65% in this period, far higher than their 21% share of world non-agricultural GDP. Since 2005, the growth gap has widened further. And according to the fiscal policy statements, the nominal GDP is projected to grow with agricultural share at 15.4 year on year in 2023 and 2024 as against 19.5% in 2021 to 2022. The real GDP is projected to grow by 7% year on year relative to 8.7% in 2021 to 2022. Agriculture-driven growth, poverty reduction, and food security are at risk. Multiple shocks from COVID-19 related disruptions to extreme weather, pests, and conflicts are impacting food systems, resulting in higher food prices and growing hunger. And also, the war in Ukraine has triggered a global food crisis that is driving millions more into extreme poverty. The World Bank is making up to $30 billion available as part of a global response to the food crisis. Agricultural development is one of the most powerful tools to end the extreme poverty, boost shared prosperity, and feed a projected 9.7 billion people by 2050. Growth in the agriculture sector is 2 to 4 times more effective in raising incomes among the poorest compared to other sectors. And research by the International Food Policy Research Institute points out that a wide range of successful programs have reduced hunger while raising agricultural productivity over the last several decades, including the Green Revolution. So, what is Green Revolution? The Green Revolution is the boost in grain production associated with the scientific discovery of new hybrid seeds, varieties of wheat, rice, and corn that have resulted in high farm yields in many developing countries. Green Revolution successes in Asia, containment of wheat, rust, improved maize and pest-resistant cassavas in sub-Saharan Africa, shallow tube wells for rice and homestead food production in Bangladesh, hybrid rice and mung bean improvement in East Asia, pearl millet and sorghum, and smallholder dairy marketing in India, improved tilapia in the Philippines, successful land tenure reform in China and Vietnam, cotton reforms in Burkina Faso, and improvements of markets in Kenya. Total Factor Productivity or TFP. It measures the total effectiveness of an economy in applying all of its factors of production. TFP growth rate is the gap between GDP growth rate and the weighted average of the growth rate of the factors of production. It includes the measuring of the amount of agricultural output produced from the combined set of land, labor, capital, and material resources employed in farm production. This is computed by dividing the net output by the labor and capital input. The technologies and practices that increase productivity can also be harnessed to cultivate resilience, especially to pandemics that can strike with little warning with catastrophic results. And agricultural productivity measured as total factor productivity or TFP rises when producers uses technologies and production practices that generate more livestock and crops from the same amount or less land, labor, fertilizer, machinery, feed, and livestock. TFP increases when large numbers of producers adopt technologies and practices that use inputs more efficiently to produce additional input. Updated data from USDA Economic Research Service on productivity growth around the world showing we are falling short of targets to sustainably meeting growing global demand for food, feed, fiber, and bioenergy. The Global Agriculture Productivity Index or GAP index estimates that TFP needs to increase at an average annual rate of 1.73% to double agricultural output levels through productivity growth from 2010 levels. The data show that globally we are below the target, with TFP increasing 1.63% per year. Most alarmingly, the TFP growth rate in low-income countries continues and growing at just 0.58% annually. This presents real challenges both for the world's ability to produce sufficient agricultural products, but the sustainability of the production process and the resilience of our agricultural system. If this trend continues, farmers in low-income food deficit countries where the population growth is rapidly rising will use more land and water to increase their output, straining a natural resource base already threatened by extreme weather events and climate change. Many low-income countries will need to import food but lack sufficient income to purchase enough to meet the needs of their citizens. Poor urban households will bear the brunt of higher food prices in these countries, but they will also impact low-income rural populations since they are net food buyers. Some of the food demand will not be met, and millions of people will be devaluated by hunger and malnutrition. Without significant increases in productivity and output, low-income countries with rapidly growing populations will not have sufficient resources to grow or import enough food for their citizens, perpetuating cycles of hunger, malnutrition, and poverty. As Figure 9.1 shows, low-income countries need to have the highest share or tend to have the highest share of the labor force in agriculture, sometimes as much as 80 to 90%. The share of agriculture in GDP is lower but can represent as much as half of the value of output. These shares would tend to fall as GDP per capita rises. This is one of the broad patterns of economic development, but attention to the time paths of the share of agricultural in specific countries reveals a great deal of variation, which is also informative. In particular, sometimes the share of labor in agriculture declines greatly even when GDP per capita does not increase much. If at all, Examples are seen in the time path of Nigeria and Brazil, as traced out in Figure 9.1. In high-income countries, productivity growth has been the sole source of agricultural output growth since the 1980s. Widespread adoption of advanced technologies has made these countries among the most efficient in the world. The traditional productivity powerhouses in North America and Europe have distinct advantages in times of pandemic. Figure 9.1 illustrates the time path of China, in which growth has been extremely rapid, but the fall of the share of labor in agriculture has been unusually slow due to significant part to restriction on rural-urban migration. Though migration out of the agriculture has greatly accelerated in the ensuing decade through 2013, in marked contrast to the historical experience of advanced countries' agricultural output in their early stages of growth, which almost contributed at least as much to total output as the share of the labor force engaged in these activities. The fact that contemporary agricultural employment in developing countries is much higher than agricultural output reflects the relatively low levels of labor productivity compared with those in manufacturing and commerce. Agricultural production continues to rise around the world, broadly keeping pace with the rising population, but the progress has been very uneven. As seen in Figure 9.2, in Asian developing countries, cereal yields per hectare in 2005 were nearly triple their 1960 levels, and production in Latin America also posted strong gains. Hunger in China fell. Agriculture in South Asia performed well, although hunger is thought to have increased in India in recent years. And in sub-Saharan Africa, yields increased by only about one-third. One of the causes is that in many areas of Africa, the population has reached a size where traditional slash and burn agricultural practices are no longer feasible without reusing land after too little rest, resulting in the significant deterioration of soil nutrients. But subsistence farmers cannot purchase improved seeds, fertilizers, and other essentials of modern agriculture. The result can be a poverty trap in which farmers must work harder and harder just to stay in place. The structure of agrarian systems in the developing world. One helpful way to categorize world agriculture proposed by the agricultural development economist Alan de Janvre and his colleagues in the World Bank's 2008 World Development Report is to see that alongside advanced agricultural systems in developed countries, three quite different situations are found among developing countries. First is the agriculture-based countries. Agriculture is still a major source of economic growth, although mainly because agriculture makes up such a large share of GDP. The World Bank estimates that agricultures account for some 32% of GDP growth on average in these countries, in which 417 million people live. More than two-thirds of the poor of these countries live in rural areas. Some 82% of the rural populations of sub-Saharan Africa lives in these countries. It also includes a few countries outside the region, such as Laos, and a few African countries, such as Senegal, are undergoing transformation. Second, most of the world's rural people, some 2.2 billion, live in what the report categorizes as transforming countries, in which the share of the poor who are rural is very high, almost 80% on average. But agriculture now contributes only a small share to GDP growth of 7% on average. Most of the population of South and East Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East lives in these countries, along with some outliers such as Guatemala. Third, in what the report calls urbanized countries, rural-urban migration has reached the point at which nearly half or more of the poor are found in the cities, and agriculture tends to contribute even less to output growth. The urbanized countries are largely found in Latin America and the Caribbean, along with the developing Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and contain about 255 million rural dwellers. Figure 9.4 shows some of the country positions in each group along with the movement over time for four major countries over an approximately three-decade period: China, India, Indonesia, and Brazil. For example, Brazil has moved from being a borderline transforming country to a solidly urbanized one according to the World Bank classification. Agricultural productivity varies dramatically across countries. As shows in Table 9.2, the variations in land productivity measured as kilograms of grain harvested per hectare of agricultural land between three developed countries, Canada, Japan, and the United States, and 12 developing countries, along with the average for low, middle, and high income countries. Despite the far smaller number of farm workers per hectare in the United States, its grain yield per hectare was about 2.4 times that of India and almost 9 times that of the DRC or the Congo. The value added per worker in US agriculture was over 75 times that of India and over 177 times that of Congo. Peasant agriculture in Latin America and Asia. Latin America and Asia, similarities and differences. In many developing countries, various historical circumstances have led to a concentration that large areas of land in the hands of a small class of powerful landowners. This is especially true in Latin America and parts of the Asian subcontinent. Although the day-to-day struggle for survival permits the lives and attitudes of impoverished peasants in both Latin America and Asia, and also Africa, although the rural structure and institution are considerably different, the nature of their agrarian systems differs markedly. The latifundio, minifundio dualistic pattern in Latin America. In Latin America, in a number of poorer and more backward areas, the peasant's is rooted in the latifundio minifundio system. So what is latifundio and minifundio? Latifundio is a very large landholding found particularly in the Latin American agrarian system, capable of providing employment for more than 12 people, owned by a small number of landlords, and comprising a disproportionate share of total agricultural land. And minifundio naman is a land holding found particularly in the Latin America agrarian system, considered too small to provide adequate employment for a single family. That's the difference. And last is the fragmented and heavily congested dwarf land holdings in Asia. In Asia, it lies primarily in fragmented and heavily congested dwarf parcels of land. The average farm size in Latin America is far larger than in Asia. Transforming economies, problems of fragmentation and subdivision of peasant land in Asia, impact of colonial rule in strengthening land tenure systems of private property rights, and the consequent rise of moneylender. The traditional Asian agrarian structure before European colonization was organized around the village. Local chiefs and peasant families each provided goods and services, and and produce labor from the peasant to the chief in return for protection, rights to use community land, and the provision of public services. Decisions on the allocation, disposition, and use of the village's most valuable resource, land, belong to the tribe or community, either as a body or through its chief. And contemporary landlordism in India and Pakistan involves absentee landlordism and persistent sharecroppers and tenant farmers. Contemporary landlords in India and Pakistan are able to avoid much of the taxation on income derived from their ownership of land. There are variations, but landlords in South Asia are often absentee owners who live in the town and turn over the working of the land to sharecroppers and other tenant farmers. So, landlord is the proprietor of a freehold interest in land with rights to lease out to tenants in return for some form of compensation for the use of the land. Sharecropper, on the other hand, is a tenant farmer whose crop has to be shared with the landlord as the basis for the rental contract. And the tenant farmer naman is one who farms on land held by a landlord and therefore lacks ownership rights and has to pay for the use of the land. For example, by giving a share of output to the owner. And lastly, the rapid population growth resulted in more fragmentation and peasant impoverishment, subsistence agriculture, and extensive cultivation in Africa. Low productivity due to lack of technology such as improved seeds and irrigation, shifting of cultivation, seasonal demand for labor depending on rainy season, high dependence on unimproved seeds sown on unfertilized rain-filled fields, uh, relatively high fraction of underutilized land, high concern about climate change impact, need for an African New Green Revolution, there are hopeful signs that it is getting underway. Subsistence farming on small plats of land is the way of life for the majority of African people living in agriculture-based economies. The great majority of farm families in tropical Africa still plant their output primarily for their own subsistence. There are important exceptions, including the sugar, cocoa, coffee, tea, and other plantations in East and West Africa, and farms devoted to such export crops as green beers in Niger, cut flowers in Kenya and Ethiopia, legumes in Tanzania, and other contract farming arrangements. And subsistence farming is the farming in which crop production, stock rearing, and other activities are conducted mainly for personal consumption.
A pleasant day to you all. I am Catherine Yunen, and I will be the discussant henceforth. So, in the latter half of this presentation, there are three more subtopics, starting with the important role of women. A major and until recently often overlooked feature of agrarian systems in the developing world, particularly in Africa and Asia, is the crucial role played by women in agricultural production. So women are much involved in this sector as they do much of the labor for cash crop production, crops produced entirely for the market, and subsistence farming, which are crops for household consumption only. So aside from that, women also raise and market livestock, perform household chores, including the processing and cooking of food, and other abundance of domestic works. And because of their diverse responsibilities and the amount of time it takes to complete such tasks, it can be said that women tend to work longer hours than men. So, as presented, a data from the UN's The World's Women 2015 report shows that women, be it in the developing countries or the developed countries, at the least do 2.5 more work than their male counterparts if unpaid work is accounted for. So, Studies concerning the allocation of women's time among different activities also have greatly increased the recognition of the importance of women's economic contribution, particularly the rural women. As a matter of fact, it is estimated that about 60% to 80% of women in Africa and Asia and 40% in Latin America provide agricultural labor. So, in a more global perspective, that is about 43% of women, and about 2 in 3 women are considered employed in farming. However, these current estimates underscore the importance of women's agricultural labor due to the diversity of women's duties. It makes it difficult to determine their share of agricultural production. So much of their work is statistically invisible, and in that sense, women often receive no compensation for the work they performed. Globally, as shown, women only make 77 cents for every dollar men earn, and the wage gap is larger for women with children. So despite the significant advances towards gender equality, persistent gaps between men and women still remain. Take the government assistance programs as an additional example, as it tend to reach men and not women. So many government sponsored programs effectively continue to exclude women, and agricultural inputs and training are rarely provided to female applicants. This is due to the fact that cultural and social barriers to women's integration into agricultural programs remain strong, because in many countries, women's income is perceived as a threat to men's authority. While men are taught new agricultural techniques to increase their productivity, women, if involved at all, are trained to perform tasks that are considered compatible with their traditional roles, that include sewing, cooking, and others other continuing, we can say that men are remunerated for their efforts, and women's role in the agricultural sector is underappreciated. So, additionally, if women farmers had the same access to resources as men, the number of hungry people in the world could be reduced by up to 150 million due to productivity gains. This is according to the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. On that note, we can infer that the gender inequality leads to significant losses in efficiency. So it must be recognized that the active participation of women is critical to agricultural prosperity and solving world hunger, and the policy design should ensure that they benefit equally from development efforts. So, continuing with our fifth subtopic, the microeconomics of farmer behavior and agricultural development. So, associated with the evolution of agricultural production or the agricultural development are 3 stages. First stage is subsistence level peasant farm. Second stage is diversified or mixed family agriculture, where a small part of the produce is for personal consumption and a significant part of it is for sale. So the third stage is specialized or modern commercial farming, which is this kind of farming is engaged in high productivity and is geared to commercial market. So, what are the possible reasons why subsistence level peasant farm hardly turn into diversified, much less specialized farming? Um, Peasants are faced with great distress due to the problems that arise with subsistence farming, some of which are failure of rains, appropriation of land, the appearance of the moneylender to collect outstanding debts. So, given the nature of their environment, the uncertainties that surround them, the need to meet the minimum survival output, and the rigid social institution into which they are locked, most farmers do behave in an economically rational manner when confronted with alternative opportunities, which is avoiding the risk that comes with these opportunities. So as insight to the economics of subsistence farming, two theories are presented. The first theory is the traditional two-factor neoclassical theory of production. So this theory provides an economic rationale for the observed low productivity of traditional agriculture in the form of the law of diminishing marginal productivity. So this theory does not satisfactorily explain why small-scale farmers are often resistant to technological innovation, farming techniques, or to the introduction of new seeds or different cash crops. Proceeding to the next theory, which is the standard theory, it is based on the crucial assumption that farmers possess perfect knowledge of all technological input-output relationships as well as current information about prevailing factor and product prices. This is the point at which the simple theory loses a good deal of its validity when applied to the environment of subsistence agriculture. So in subsistence agriculture, it is highly risky and it is an uncertain venture wherein human lives are at stake. And the main motivating factor in a peasant's life is not the maximization of income but the family's chances of survival. In that sense, it explains why they avoid the risk that comes with the alternative opportunities in farming. So aside from what I've said, the price, weather, and other uncertainty, along with limited access to credit and insurance, largely explains the extent of risk-averse behaviors observed in peasants or the poor farmers. So risk-averse subsistence farmers are also likely to prefer technologies that combine low mean per hectare with low variance to alternative high-yielding but higher risk technologies. So simply put, they want or prepare something that have minimal risk. So on that note, efforts to minimize risk and remove commercial and institutional obstacles to small farmer innovation are necessary for agricultural development. On to our last subtopic, the core requirements of a strategy of agricultural and rural development. So the main goal of agricultural and rural development is to improve living standards by increasing small farm incomes, output productivity, and food security. So, in improving small scale agriculture, there is a need for technology and innovation. It has two major sources. First is mechanized agriculture. This introduces labor saving machinery that can have a significant impact on the volume of output per worker, particularly in areas where land is abundant and labor is limited. So, for example, a man operating a machine can accomplish what can only be achieved by multiple workers using traditional methods in a short amount of time. So on to the next, the biological and chemical innovation. It raises yields per hectare to improve the condition of current land that is under scale neutral measures. So under this technological advancement, it can lead to an increase of produce regardless of its farm size. In addition, there is also a need for institutional and pricing policies that provide necessary economic incentives. So, agricultural extension services such as irrigation and access to credit must be present in order for many of the new agricultural methods to succeed, like the green revolution that Ms. Luminario had mentioned earlier in this discussion. Second, governments must provide adequate incentives to farmers to ensure sustainability of food supplies. Aside from what have been mentioned earlier, adapting to new opportunities and new constraints is also a must. In the increasing demand for food, there might be new opportunities in exporting excess food supply, particularly in horticulture and aquaculture. Also, land grabbing or foreign investment in developing farmlands may help create jobs, take advantage of better techniques, and export to new markets. Continuing, the conditions that need to be met for rural development includes land reform. Under this, agricultural and rural development that benefits the poor can succeed only through a joint effort by the government and all farmers, not just the large farmers. So, the government should engage and cooperate with all the farmers. Another is when land is very unevenly distributed in quality as well as in quantity, rural peasants can have little hope for economic advancement through agriculture. So if this continues, the small farmers will have a tiny chance of improvements. So another is giving supportive policies. Government support systems should provide the necessary incentives, economic opportunities, and access to needed credit and inputs to enable small cultivators to expand their output and raise their productivity. So, the land reform will not be effective without these policies, as these policies encourages changes in rural institutions that control production and in government pricing policies on inputs and outputs for farmers. So next is, and lastly, the integrated development objectives. So the primary purpose of rural development is to improve the agricultural productivity of small farmers. So aside from that, there are other objectives that can pursue both rural development and national development. First, there should be efforts to raise both farm and non-farm rural real incomes through job creation, rural industrialization, and other non-farm opportunities, and the government should also develop or enhance basic human necessities. Next is there should be a decreasing inequality in the distribution of rural incomes and a lessening of urban rural imbalances in incomes and economic opportunities. So there should be no discrimination or inequity between urban and rural areas. So next, there should be a successful attention to the need for environmental sustainability and preventing the harmful misuse of agrochemicals and other inputs. So this means that conserving and protecting our environment and natural resources can also aid in our development. Lastly, we should also pay attention to the capacity of the rural sector to sustain and accelerate the pace of these improvements over time. So we must assist and guide rural areas in becoming developmentally capable. So as a concluding statement to the discussion of agricultural transformation, and rural development. The said objectives encourages the equality of rural and urban areas. So alongside urban areas, rural areas should also continue to expand and have equal opportunities so that the people that live there can also advance in all parts of life, not only farming.